Let me set the table for you so you know just exactly how much damage the firing of Brian France did to the sport of NASCAR racing on Monday. We go back just a day before. NASCAR's poster child, its golden boy, its top merchandise seller since the retirement of Dale Earnhardt Jr. last year, Chase Elliott, finally got his first Cup Series win, a major breakthrough, and one that many people were starting to speculate would not be coming. Casey Atwood, he is not. There was a wave of positivity. There were reports from the garage area from longtime members of the NASCAR community that it felt like the first win for Dale Earnhardt Jr. back in 2000, a sweeping positivity that even encompassed kind of the hateful and angry internet community. Most people were very happy and positive towards this victory of Chase Elliott. It looked like this was a positive thing for NASCAR in a season that has not been very positive. Fans have been very upset with a variety of things, not to mention the things that they're already quite upset about from previous seasons, such as the gimmicks, the chase, all that stuff. But this season, perhaps even worse. The racing hasn't particularly been all that entertaining, and very few winners have taken victories in this season, or very few drivers, I should say. So when Chase Elliott took this win, it accomplished several things. It got a new driver in victory lane. It got the most popular driver in the series into victory lane, and for the first time, and nonetheless on a road course at the Watkins Glen Raceway. So it was certainly a driver talent-based race. It was one that you would think would establish a brand new star in the sport. And yet the headlines on Monday morning after that race, after you would think that NASCAR would be in the headlines for the right reasons, the headlines read, NASCAR CEO arrested for DUI and drug charges. Of course, Brian France, what hasn't been said about him already? Many people, rightly or wrongly, do not like him. They feel like his opinions on the sport are iffy at best, or maybe not well thought out at best, and at worst, maybe he's intentionally trying to wreck the sport. I don't believe that for a second. But I would say about Brian France, just prior to this, it did not seem like Brian France was particularly, even in the days where he had more power in the dictations of where the sport was heading, I don't think he was particularly interested. You see that with a lot of third-generation family members who step in and run the family business. A lot of times the phrase is said, the first generation builds it, the second generation grows it, and the third generation kills it. And if that's the case, that's certainly what's going on with NASCAR right now. That being said, Brian France is not as responsible for a lot of the current NASCAR product as a lot of people want to give him credit for. There was a report that came out about a year and a half ago that said Brian France was really just a figurehead, and a variety of powerful people who had bought their way into the company or risen through the ranks were actually running the company. That was a family decision to move Brian out of a position of power. That being said, Brian was still in place as the figurehead of the sport, the CEO, of course. And from now on, or from time to time, he would come out and make statements and endorse some political candidates. And just, it seemed like every time Brian France would come out, it would just make situations that were already bad worse, or at least more confusing. And none more bad than this, the DUI charge. And as well, drugs, possession of drugs, possession particularly of oxycodone, which is a controlled substance, not outright banned. You can get a prescription for it, but unfortunately, without getting too political, prescription drugs are far too easy to get your hands on these days. Doctors will sign opioids to any person who says, oh, my back hurts, or I'm feeling a little bit sad. Oh, well, you need some opioids. They're very easy to get your hands on, particularly if you're someone higher up. Now, a very dangerous drug. It's, I believe, related in some respects to cocaine. And I actually did a little bit of research on this drug before I came on for this video, because it is a very serious subject matter. And in reading, it said that it can be deadly when ingested with alcohol. And of course, Brian France was found driving at 2 times the legal limit in the state of New York. That, I mean, just thinking from a PR standpoint, not only is he the CEO, he's the CEO of a sport which requires drivers to drive. And the implication that a CEO of a driving racing company, or just any, you imagine if Mary Barra, who runs GM, were to get a DUI. I mean, it's like the one thing the one crime you wouldn't want to commit when running something to do with the automobile, and he did it. We also talk about, and this is another thing, when he would come out and make statements, people would speculate that he didn't seem all there. Maybe he, was just tired, or maybe some people said he was just stupid. There are certain signs. I mean, if you watch an episode of Cops and you look at someone who's on drugs or maybe has a drinking problem, you can usually tell. And I found a lot of ways with stuff like this, your first impression is usually the right one, whether or not someone is under the influence or not. So my question is, especially seeing as Brian France was really no longer in any kind of power, why there was never a move to quietly get him out as soon as possible. I know people have been talking about Ben Kennedy, a former NASCAR driver related to the France family. I believe he's the great-grandson of Bill France Sr., if I'm not mistaken. I'm possibly mistaken on that one. But he recently stepped away from the driving seat and began working at upper-level management in NASCAR, and the speculation was that he would eventually take over the CEO role. But again, who are these people underneath Brian France who are really running the show behind the scenes, and they didn't have the judgment to say, Brian's not in any state to run this company or even be processed as running the company. Why is he there? And I think a lot of people are talking like, oh, Brian France is the reason the sport is dead or it's dying. And I would say it's probably the people behind him who didn't have the judgment from a business standpoint to get him out of there, because he was clearly a drug addict and clearly an alcoholic. Or from a human perspective, to get the guy help. And this is a family-run business. It's private. It's not public. So why was this disregard for Brian France's health and the health of the business ignored? You would generally think you would want to expound risk. And certainly, Brian France has hurt the sport. In fact, there was actually a policy put forth during the Brian France administration in NASCAR, which I think was actually put in place when Brian France still had some negligible power in the overall day-to-day running of NASCAR, called actions detrimental to stock car racing. It was a fine or a penalty that would be handed down to a driver that NASCAR felt was in some way saying to the press or saying to a media source or in an interview or even to fans, or just happen to, flip a bird and have it be caught on TV, they could possibly be subject to fines or points penalties or even race suspensions for actions detrimental to stock car racing. A lot of times this would just be used when a driver would come out and dissent from policy. Maybe would criticize the tires, criticize the point standings, criticize race victories or lack of penalties or any number of things. Rules enforcement generally within the sport. Something that wouldn't get out into the mainstream press, wouldn't make Fox News or CNN, would barely make ESPN if someone like Tony Stewart comes out and says the Goodyear tire wasn't good enough this weekend, we need to change it. That would be a penalty. I can't imagine there was anything more detrimental to stock car racing, an action more detrimental to stock car racing, than driving drunk, being caught with illegal or controlled substances, and then having your mugshot pasted all over social media, all over the news, and stealing the headlines away from your meal ticket. I kind of look at Chase Elliott as the last driver to kind of be riding the wave of superstardom that really kind of began around the Jeff Gordon era. When Jeff Gordon kind of rose to power in NASCAR, he kind of changed the way that that NASCAR drivers are marketed. You got the Tony Stewarts, you got the Dale Juniors, you got the Chase Elliots. And I think Chase Elliott may be the last driver who was able to benefit in any way from that kind of marketing. I think it seems, at least to me, that everything's beginning to shift in NASCAR. And the last time, maybe Chase Elliott's the last driver they could really build as a star, and his first win will always have this taint on it, which is, wow, remember Chase Elliott's first win? Yeah, that was the weekend that Brian France got that DUI. This is going to have long-lasting effects. Like we've said, the mainstream media coverage is long-reaching and comprehensive. Lots and lots of talk all over the place. And guess what? CEOs of companies that are either involved in the sport right now, or possibly leaving the sport right now, or possibly looking at coming into the sport, are going to be reading right now about NASCAR. It's that their CEO was negligent. I think that's, his trial is on September 14th, but it clearly seems like this is a pretty cut and dried case, as usually DUIs are. Negligent enough to drive under the influence and with controlled substances in his car. And I have said about NASCAR, just in general, that things are going to get worse before they get better. And there's some people trying to spin this in the positive direction, like, oh, hey, look, Brian France is gone now. Again, the problem is Brian France has never been in power, at least recently. So the people who kept Brian France in there and kept him in there when it was, I'm sure it had to have been clear that there was a problem. I don't believe for a second that nobody knew this, at least that were close to Brian France. Because if outside observers like me or anybody else who watched a press conference or read quotes from Brian France, especially in the recent years, couldn't tell that something was off, imagine what the people that actually see him day to day knew. So those people are still in charge. And they're probably not going to stop being in charge. So I don't see how this gets better. It's going to bottom out at some point. Unfortunately, it looks like Brian France has greased the skids of the fall. And it's probably going to get very, very bad within the next couple of years. And hopefully someone will step in and fix it. Now, on a temporary basis, it looks like that guy's going to be Jim France. If you don't know Jim France, obviously his last name suggests that he's related to the France family. But he has currently, or at least since the mid-2000s, right about the time that Brian France took over the CEO duties at NASCAR, Jim went off on his own and pursued his passion, which was sports car racing. Now, I've never agreed with Jim France on sports car racing. He and I are on opposite ends of that political spectrum. He started a series in 2003 called the Grand American Sports Car Series, aka Grand Am. That series would eventually become the current modern-day IMSA, WeatherTech United Sports Car Championship. That is one of, at the moment, and believe me, there are some political problems there too, but at the moment, it's probably one of, if not the fastest-growing motorsports in the United States. Jim France knows how to run a racing series. He's passionate about the sport, and it seems like, again, if you want to be there, if you're France, you could probably, especially once you get older, probably step back and not have to be involved. But in more recent years, he's become involved in the stock car side of things. He was crucial in brokering the ARCA buyout deal. Now, whether or not you feel positively about that move, again, is up for debate. But at the very least, he's making moves that are trying to strengthen NASCAR, not tear it down. Do I think Jim France is going to stay in there and stay in power? No, I don't believe so. I personally don't think he's interested, and I don't blame him if he's not. If I had a choice of running IMSA or running NASCAR, I know what I would choose. But we're just going to have to wait and see. there's always those rumors of the buyout, which may have either hurt the value of this or maybe sped up the process of selling NASCAR as a whole. These next couple of years, again, are going to be very, very telling about where NASCAR goes and what's going on with it. But it's not necessarily all sunshines and puppy dogs and roses and unicorns and all that stuff. Again, it's going to get worse before it gets better. I guess if you're looking for a positive here, Brian France doing this, again, it greased the skids, so it's going to be like ripping the Band-Aid off faster rather than slower. But it is going to be a long recovery process for NASCAR to go forward from this. And it hasn't helped that they really haven't acknowledged it all that much either. I think even in their press release, they didn't even mention why Jim France was taking over temporarily as the CEO of the company. But regardless, people want to know my thoughts on this. Those are my thoughts, at least at the moment. I'm sorry this was a bit heavier than it usually is, a little bit more political. I don't really like to mix politics with racing, but this was one that kind of needed a little bit of perspective from that perspective. So thank you guys. Again, I'm sure I don't have to ask, but let me know your opinions in the comments. I'd be really interested to hear where you think NASCAR is going to go from here. Did Brian France getting fired, did it help? Do you think there's any positives to take away from here, or is it just negatives? Again, going to be an interesting discussion down in the comments. Can't wait to read it. Sorry this isn't the most positive video in the world, but I don't see a whole lot of positives from this situation.